Chapter 15. The account is settled. You see! Pavel Pavlovitch skipped up to Velchaninoff as soon as the youth had departed. Yes, you've no luck, said Velchaninoff carelessly. He would not have said those words had he not been tortured and exasperated by the pain in his chest, which was growing more and more acute. It was because you felt for me you didn't give me back the bracelet, wasn't it? I hadn't time. You felt for me from your heart like a true friend? Oh, yes, I felt for you, said Velchaninoff in exasperation. He told him briefly, however, how the bracelet had been returned to him, and how Nadezhda Fedosyevna had almost forced him to assist in returning it. You understand that nothing else would have induced me to take it. I've had unpleasantness enough apart from that. You were fascinated and took it? Sniggered Pavel Pavlovitch. That's stupid on your part. However, I must excuse you. You saw for yourself just now that I'm not the leading person, that there are others in this affair. At the same time, you were fascinated. Pavel Pavlovitch sat down and filled up his glass. Do you imagine I'd give way to that wretched boy? I'll make mincemeat of him, so there! I'll go over tomorrow and polish him off. We'll smoke out that spirit from the nursery. He emptied his glass almost at a gulp and filled it again. He began, in fact, to behave in an unusually free and easy way. Ah, Nadenka and Shashenka, the sweet little darlings! He was beside himself with anger. There came another louder clap of thunder, followed by a blinding flash of lightning, and the rain began streaming in bucketfuls. Pavel Pavlovitch got up and closed the open window. He asked you whether you were afraid of the thunder. Velchaninoff afraid of thunder. Kobilnikov, what was it? Kobilnikov, and what about being 50 too, eh? Do you remember? Pavel Pavlovitch sneered diabolically. You've established yourself here, it seems, observed Velchaninoff, hardly able to articulate the words for the pain in his chest. Lie down, you can do what you like. Why, you couldn't turn a dog out in weather like this, Pavel Pavlovitch retorted in an aggrieved tone, seeming almost pleased, however, at having an excuse for feeling aggrieved. All right, sit down, drink. Stay the night if you like, muttered Velchaninoff. He stretched himself on the sofa and uttered a faint groan. Stay the night? And you won't be afraid? What of? Said Velchaninoff, suddenly raising his head. Oh, nothing. Last time you were so frightened, or was it my fancy? You're stupid, Velchaninoff could not help saying. He turned his head to the wall angrily. All right, responded Pavel Pavlovitch. The sick man fell asleep suddenly, a minute after lying down. The unnatural strain upon him that day, in the shattered state of his health, had brought on a sudden crisis, and he was as weak as a child. But the pain asserted itself again and got the upper hand of sleep and weariness. An hour later he woke up and painfully got up from the sofa. The storm had subsided. The room was full of tobacco smoke. On the table stood an empty bottle, and Pavel Pavlovitch was asleep on another sofa. He was lying on his back, with his head on the sofa cushion, fully dressed and with his boots on. His lorgnette had slipped out of his pocket and was hanging down almost to the floor. His hat was lying on the ground beside it. Velchaninoff looked at him morosely and did not attempt to wake him. Writhing with pain and pacing about the room, for he could no longer bear to lie down, he moaned and brooded over his agonies. He was afraid of that pain in his chest, and not without reason. He had been liable to these attacks for a very long time, but they had only occurred at intervals of a year or two. He knew that they came from the liver. At first a dull, not acute, but irritating feeling of oppression was, as it were, concentrated at some point in the chest, under the shoulder blade or higher up. Continually increasing, sometimes for 10 hours at a stretch, the pain at last would reach such a pitch, the oppression would become so insupportable, that the sufferer began to have visions of dying. On his last attack, a year before, he was, when the pain ceased after 10 hours of suffering, so weak that he could scarcely move his hands as he lay in bed, and the doctor had allowed him to take nothing for the whole day but a few teaspoonfuls of weak tea and of bread soaked in broth, like a tiny baby. The attacks were brought on by different things, but never occurred except when his nerves were out of order. It was strange, too, how the attack passed off. Sometimes it was possible to arrest it at the very beginning, during the first half-hour, by simple compresses, and it would pass away completely at once. Sometimes, as on his last attack, nothing was of any use, and the pain only subsided after numerous and continually recurring paroxysms of vomiting. The doctor confessed afterwards that he believed it to be a case of poisoning. It was a long time to wait till morning, and he didn't want to send for the doctor at night. Besides, he didn't like doctors. At last he could not control himself and began moaning aloud. His groans waked Pavel Pavlovitch. He sat up on the sofa, and for some time listened with alarm and bewilderment, watching Velchaninoff, who was almost running backwards and forwards through the 2 rooms. The bottle of champagne had had a great effect upon him, evidently more than usual, and it was some time before he could collect himself. At last he grasped the position and rushed to Velchaninoff, who mumbled something in reply to him. "It's the liver, I know it!" cried Pavel Pavlovitch, becoming extremely animated all at once. "Pyotr Kuzmich Polosuhin used to suffer just the same from liver. You ought to have compresses. Pyotr Kuzmich always had compresses. One may die of it. Shall I run for Mavra?" No need. Velchaninoff waved him off irritably. "I want nothing." But Pavel Pavlovitch, goodness knows why, seemed beside himself, as though it were a question of saving his own son. Without heeding Velchaninoff's protests, he insisted on the necessity of compresses, and also of 2 or 3 cups of weak tea to be drunk on the spot. "And not simply hot, but boiling." He ran to Mavra without waiting for permission. With her laid a fire in the kitchen, which always stood empty, and blew up the samovar. At the same time he succeeded in getting the sick man to bed, took off his clothes, wrapped him up in a quilt, and within 20 minutes had prepared tea and compresses. "This is a hot plate, scalding hot," he said almost ecstatically, applying the heated plate wrapped up in a napkin on Velchaninov's aching chest. "There are no other compresses, and plates, I swear on my honor, will be even better. They were laid on Pyotr Kuzmich. I saw it with my own eyes, and did it with my own hands. One may die of it, you know. Drink your tea, swallow it. Never mind about scalding yourself. Life is too precious for one to be squeamish." He quite flustered Mavra, who was half asleep. The plates were changed every 3 or 4 minutes. After the third plate and the second cup of tea, swallowed at a gulp, Velchaninov felt a sudden relief. "If once they've shifted the pain, thank God, it's a good sign," cried Pavel Pavlovitch, and he ran joyfully to fetch a fresh plate and a fresh cup of tea. "If only we can ease the pain, if only we can keep it under," he kept repeating. Half an hour later the pain was much less, but the sick man was so exhausted that in spite of Pavel Pavlovitch's entreaties he refused to put up with just one more nice little plate. He was so weak that everything was dark before his eyes. "Sleep, sleep," he repeated in a faint voice. "To be sure," Pavel Pavlovitch assented. "You'll stay the night. What time is it?" "It's nearly 2 o'clock. It's 1:45. "You'll stay the night." I will. A minute later the sick man called Pavel Pavlovitch again. You, he muttered, when the latter had run up and was bending over him. "You are better than I am. I understand it all. Thank you." Sleep, whispered Pavel Pavlovitch, and he hastened on tiptoe to his sofa. As he fell asleep, the invalid heard Pavel Pavlovitch noiselessly making up a bed for himself and taking off his clothes. Finally, putting out the candle and almost holding his breath for fear of waking the patient, he stretched himself on his sofa. There is no doubt that Velchaninov did sleep, and that he fell asleep very soon after the candle was put out. He remembered this clearly afterwards. But all the time he was asleep, up to the very moment that he woke up, he dreamed that he was not asleep, and that in spite of his exhaustion he could not get to sleep. At last he began to dream that he was in a sort of waking delirium, and that he could not drive away the phantoms that crowded about him, although he was fully conscious that it was only delirium and not reality. The phantoms were all familiar figures. His room seemed to be full of people, and the door into the passage stood open. People were coming in crowds and thronging the stairs. At the table, which was set in the middle of the room, there was sitting one man, exactly as in the similar dream he had had a month before. Just as in that dream, this man sat with his elbows on the table and would not speak. But this time he was wearing a round hat with crape on it. What? Could it have been Pavel Pavlovitch that time too? Velchaninov thought. But glancing at the face of the silent man, he convinced himself that it was someone quite different. Why has he got crape on? Velchaninov wondered. The noise, the talking, and the shouting of the people crowding round the table was awful. These people seemed to be even more intensely exasperated against Velchaninoff than in the previous dream. They shook their fists at him and shouted something to him with all their might, but what it was exactly he could not make out. "But it's delirium, of course. I know it's delirium," he thought. "I know I couldn't get to sleep, and that I've got up now, because it made me too wretched to go on lying down." But the shouts, the people, their gestures were so lifelike, so real, that sometimes he was seized by doubt. Can this be really delirium? Good heavens, what do these people want of me? But if it were not an hallucination, would it be possible that such a clamour should not have waked Pavel Pavlovitch all this time? There he is, asleep on the sofa. At last something suddenly happened again, just as in that other dream. All of them made a rush for the stairs, and they were closely packed in the doorway, for there was another crowd forcing its way into the room. These people were bringing something in with them, something big and heavy. He could hear how heavily the steps of those carrying it sounded on the stairs, and how hurriedly their panting voices called to one another. All the people in the room shouted, "They're bringing it! They're bringing it!" All eyes were flashing and fixed on Velchaninoff. All of them pointed towards the stairs, menacing and triumphant. Feeling no further doubt that it was reality and not hallucination, he stood on tiptoe so as to peep over the people's heads and find out as soon as possible what they were bringing up the stairs. His heart was beating, 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 and suddenly, exactly as in that first dream, he heard 3 violent rings at the bell. And again it was so distinct, so real, so unmistakable a ring at the bell that it could not be only a dream. But he did not rush to the door as he had done on awaking then. What idea guided his first movement, and whether he had any idea at the moment, it is impossible to say. But someone seemed to prompt him what he must do. He leaped out of bed, and, with his hands stretched out before him as though to defend himself and ward off an attack, rushed straight towards the place where Pavel Pavlovitch was asleep. His hands instantly came into contact with other hands, stretched out above him, and he clutched them tight. So someone already stood bending over him. The curtains were drawn, but it was not quite dark, for a faint light came from the other room where there were no such curtains. Suddenly, with an acute pain, something cut the palm and fingers of his left hand, and he instantly realized that he had clutched the blade of a knife or razor, and was grasping it tight in his hand. And at the same moment something fell heavily on the floor with a thud. Velchaninoff was perhaps 3 times as strong as Pavel Pavlovitch. Yet the struggle between them lasted a long while, fully 3 minutes. He soon got him down on the floor and bent his arms back behind him, but for some reason he felt he must tie his hands behind him. Holding the murderer with his wounded left hand, he began with his right fumbling for the cord of the window curtain, and for a long time could not find it, but at last got hold of it and tore it from the window. He wondered himself afterwards at the immense effort required to do this. During those 3 minutes neither of them uttered a word. Nothing was audible but their heavy breathing and the muffled sounds of their struggling. Having at last twisted Pavel Pavlovitch's arms behind him and tied them together, Velchaninoff left him on the floor, got up, drew the curtain from the window, and pulled up the blind. It was already light in the deserted street. Opening the window, he stood for some moments drawing in deep breaths of fresh air. It was a little past 4. Shutting the window, he went hurriedly to the cupboard, took out a clean towel, and bound it tightly round his left hand to stop the bleeding. At his feet an open razor was lying on the carpet. He picked it up, shut it, put it in the razor case, which had been left forgotten since the morning on the little table beside Pavel Pavlovitch's sofa, and locked it up in his bureau. And only when he had done all that, he went up to Pavel Pavlovitch and began to examine him. Meantime, the latter had with an effort got up from the floor and seated himself in an armchair. He had nothing on but his shirt, not even his boots. The back and the sleeves of his shirt were soaked with blood, but the blood was not his own. It came from Velchaninov's wounded hand. Of course it was Pavel Pavlovitch, but anyone meeting him by chance might almost have failed to recognize him at the minute, so changed was his whole appearance. He was sitting awkwardly upright in the armchair, owing to his hands being tied behind his back. His face looked distorted, exhausted, and greenish, and he quivered all over from time to time. He looked at Velchaninoff fixedly, but with lustreless, unseeing eyes. All at once he smiled vacantly, and, nodding towards a bottle of water that stood on the table, he said in a meek half-whisper, "Water. I should like some water." Velchaninoff filled the glass and began holding it for him to drink. Pavel Pavlovitch bent down greedily to the water. After 3 gulps he raised his head and looked intently into the face of Velchaninoff, who was standing beside him with the glass in his hand. But without uttering a word he fell to drinking again. When he had finished, he sighed deeply. Velchaninoff took his pillow, seized his outer garments, and went into the other room, locking Pavel Pavlovitch into the first room. The pain had passed off completely, but he was conscious of extreme weakness again after the momentary effort in which he had displayed an unaccountable strength. He tried to reflect upon what had happened, but his thoughts were hardly coherent. The shock had been too great. Sometimes there was a dimness before his eyes lasting for 10 minutes or so. Then he would start, wake up, recollect everything, remember his smarting hand bound up in a blood-stained towel, and would fall to thinking greedily, feverishly. He came to one distinct conclusion. That is, that Pavel Pavlovitch certainly had meant to cut his throat, but that perhaps only a quarter of an hour before had not known that he would do it. The razor case had perhaps merely caught his eye the evening before, and, without arousing any thought of it at the time, had remained in his memory. The razors were always locked up in the bureau, and only the morning before Velchaninoff had taken them out to shave round his mustache and whiskers, as he sometimes did. "If he had long been intending to murder me, he would have got a knife or pistol ready. He would not have reckoned on my razor, which he had never seen till yesterday evening," was one reflection he made among others. It struck 6 o'clock at last. Velchaninoff roused himself, dressed, and went in to Pavel Pavlovitch. Opening the door, he could not understand why he had locked Pavel Pavlovitch in, instead of turning him out of the house. To his surprise, the criminal was fully dressed. Most likely he had found some way of untying his hands. He was sitting in the armchair, but got up at once when Velchaninoff went in. His hat was already in his hand. His uneasy eyes seemed in haste to say, "Don't begin talking. It's no use beginning. There's no need to talk." "Go," said Velchaninoff. "Take your bracelet," he added, calling after him. Pavel Pavlovitch turned back from the door, took the case with the bracelet from the table, put it in his pocket, and went out on the stairs. Velchaninoff stood at the door to lock it behind him. Their eyes met for the last time. Pavel Pavlovitch stopped suddenly. For 5 seconds the two looked into each other's eyes, as though hesitating. Finally, Velchaninoff waved his hand faintly. "Well, go," he said in a low voice, and locked the door.